Hey fellow gliders, I'm back with an advanced glide trick known as the Trebuchet Method. Now the Trebuchet Method is a little complicated and it involves some work on the back end, but once you're able to master it, it will really open up your apps in terms of additional functionality. Now take a look at the app I have here. Let's say I wanted to keep track of which items I have. I have a list of just materials here, right? And if you're keeping track for just yourself, you could create a user-specific column here. Let me show you how to do that. So here's my list of items. And in the data sheet for this list of items, I could create a new column called owned, where it is a basic column Boolean, but it's user-specific. So that way, if I sign into the app and somebody else signs into the app, we have two complete different experiences as to who owns what. Right? It's user-specific. This does require that you have user profiles set up. So if you don't know how to set up user profiles, check the Glide documentation and make sure that you have that set up prior to moving forward here. All right, if I hit done, right, I can kind of keep track of what's owned and what's not owned now, maybe through a checklist here where the check is the owned status. Right, I don't need email addresses here. Right, so if I were to own pencils, folders, and markers, great. And if somebody else signs into the app, right, they have a completely different list. They could own pens, glue, and crayons, right, and they can kind of keep track of their own items. This is really great, again, if you're keeping track of just one person's items. But what happens if this user and this user want to share a list of items? In this case, you can't use a user-specific column because those columns are just that, user-specific. And there's no way to have shared user-specific columns because Glide doesn't have that function natively. However, if you use the Trebuchet method, we can actually develop our own group-specific columns. All right, let me show you how to do that. So here in my list, I'm going to get rid of this owned column. We don't need that anymore. And back in my inline list, I'm going to convert this back to a list view. We don't need the email address. Fine, something like this. All right, the setup is as such. So I have a user sheet. This user sheet has a couple of users in it at the moment. I also have here a connection sheet where we're going to connect a list of users to the primary user. There's a variety of ways you could do this. The easiest way is maybe just having the first person who signs into the app can invite a user, right? So if I invite a new user here, maybe I'll invite test2@email.com and I give them the name of Jimmy, right? I can submit and this will write those values to the connection sheet here. I'm passing my email address as the lead email. And then afterwards, I also have a add row function on here where I'm adding the email and name to the user sheet as well. So that way, when that user signs in, their name is already pre-populated. All right, so I'm going to hit submit. Invitation was sent. Great. So now if I were to check my sheet here, you see I have a new connection. Sorry, a new connection here. This was the original email, the test@email.com. And actually, I really wanted it to have been from this email, so I'm going to fake that because really I wanted to be this person. And then in the user sheet, you see that that record was already created here as well. All right, a couple of things. In the user sheet, I have a relation to that invite. So here I'm relating the email address to the connection's email address to see whether or not this email was one that is a lead email or one that was an invited email. In this case, test and test2 were invited emails. So it's going to find a match. And then I'm looking up the lead email lookup. So this is going to return the email address of the person who invited those users. And then I have an if then else to say, hey, if this lead email lookup is empty, we'll then grab the email address of the person. Otherwise, grab the email address of the lead email lookup. So this column here will always contain the lead users. It will never contain the email addresses of invited users. All right, so that being said, in my connection sheet, I also have created a template column here called item list. And this is going to be, sorry, not template, a text column called item list. And this is going to house our Trebuchet record of comma separated values for our list. Let's go ahead and clear it for now. And then lastly, in our list, we have an item. I have a row ID and an image for those items. These are the only three things that are living in this sheet. So if I come over here to list, you see this, all it is in the Google Sheet. Okay, then I'm doing I'm pulling in the lead email. So this is a template column. I'm grabbing the email, and this is that if then else from the user sheet to only grab the lead email. So it doesn't matter who I'm signed in as. If I'm signed in as Robert, Bob, or Jimmy, right? I'm going to grab the lead email here. Okay, then I'm doing a relation from the lead email to the connection sheet here. And the purpose of that is because I want a connection from that list of items to our item list text column in our connection sheet. So here is that relation connection. And then doing a lookup of the item list lookup. So in this case, right now it's empty because I have nothing in there. But let's say I had paper, right? I can copy this row ID in here to the item list. And you see that now I have an item in there. Fine. I'll leave that in there for now. Okay, so then here is this setup. What we're going to be doing is instead of creating a list of items that on a separate log somewhere, we are going to house that list of items in the item list column in that connection sheet. And then it's going to, again, be a lookup here of the item list lookup sheet. There we go. Okay, there it is. Now, in order to create new items here, we need to create a scenario where we are going to be adding the row IDs of new items to the existing list and then slinging this, trebucheting it, right, back to the connections item list column. So I have a couple of columns set up for that. The first one is that temporary item. Okay, so this temporary item is going to be a value. You see this is user specific. And this is just going to be a temporary column for housing the row ID of the item that I'm selecting that I want to add to my list. So I already have paper, but maybe I wanted to add pencils, right? So eventually I'm going to create a button here, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit, where I'm going to add this row ID to the temp item here, like so. Next, I'm creating that comma separated list here in this add item template. So this add item template is joining the existing items, in this case O for old, right? The existing items that I have in this item list lookup, which again is coming from that connections column, followed by a comma, followed by that temporary item. Now you do see here, spoiler alert, that I'm also having a condition on this comma to only show up in certain circumstances. It's in this if comma. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sling this template column here, which now has both values, the pencil and the paper. Right? You see how if I copy this and come over here and paste it in my address bar, you see I have two items that are comma separated. And we're going to sling this, right, back to our connections and paste that in as the new value, like that. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing through some custom actions. Now if I come back to my list, right, eventually we're going to clear that temporary item, right, and now we'll have a new item list lookup. All right, so you see that this if comma column has a comma in it at the moment. Okay, the issue was happening was that what if you don't have any items in your list yet? Well, if you don't have any items in your list, that means that you don't have any items in this lookup, which means in your template column, this O is going to be empty, and it's going to start off with a comma. And we can't have that for the Trebuchet method. So we need that comma to be conditional based on whether or not there are already items in our lookup. So I have an if then else column here called if comma, which is only going to display a comma if the item list lookup is not empty. Right? If it is empty, that means that there's no items in my list yet and I shouldn't display a comma. Okay, so this comma again in this template column is conditional. That's the only really tricky part to all of this that we had to figure out was that stupid comma. So now all we have left to do is create that action. Now before we create that action, I want some sort of visual confirmation that we actually are changing our list here. So I'm going to include some icons, a green check mark or just this empty white emoji maybe of the items I have versus the items I don't have. So to do that, I'm going to be looking at this item list lookup column. Right now it's empty, right? But what I want to do is I'm going to eventually split those items using a split text column here. And I'm going to be looking at this item list lookup column, and I'm splitting it by the comma, right? So again, if I have in this item list that comma separated value here, back in my list, you see that I have this split item list, and I have two values in there. So it's basically creating an array column based off of this lookup. Okay, then from there, I'm relating the row ID of the item here to that split item list. And you see that I have columns now that are empty and ones that are not empty. And then as a visual indicator, I have this if my item icon, if it is in my list, which is simply looking at this rel item list to say, hey, if it's empty, then give me this empty emoji, otherwise give me this green check mark emoji. Okay, so these three columns are working together just to give me some visuals as to what I'm adding and not adding. All right, so let's go back and erase all the values from our item list because we want to create that from scratch. All right, the only thing I haven't pre-created here is the action to allow us to add these items. So here in the list, instead of showing the actual item here, well, let's get both. I'm going to have a card view. So we have here the item. And then in the header of this, let's go ahead and place that icon. Maybe we can do it as the avatar. So the avatar, we will have the icon. Right, so we can see if we own that item or not. And we don't need all this other stuff. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So there's a couple of ways we could do this, right? We could have it on the details screen, like a little button here that has all of our actions. That's a good idea if you need them to visit the details screen here. But maybe we just want to add or allow them to select things from here, right? So in that case, you can create a custom action just right off of this inline list. So we're going to do that for our purposes today. I'm going to click on the inline list, scroll down, and then visit this action. And we're going to create a new action. And this action is going to be our Trebuchet action. So our action name, Trebuchet. All right, a few parts to this. So the first thing we need to do is add the item ID of the item that we're selecting to that temporary item column, that user-specific one we'd had in our item list. So we are going to do a set column, and we're going to set this item. To this temporary item, we are going to grab the row ID. And that's all we're going to do for this for the moment. Okay, so that will write, so if we're choosing pencils, right? The row ID of pencils is now living in that user-specific column, which means that it's being acted upon by that template column. So in our template column right next to it, we have the combined old and new, right? In this case, old is empty. So all we have right now is the pencil row ID. Okay, afterwards, we're going to sling that template column to the connections sheet where we have our item list column. So we need to do another set column. And we're not going to choose this row. We're going to choose the relation to our connection. Remember, that's how we're getting our lookup of our item list. So the rel connection. And we're going to replace whatever's in our item list with the new template column from this previous set column. So this item list is now going to be our add item template, which again contains our old comma, which is conditional new. Okay. Then the last thing we're going to do is clear our temporary column. So again, we're going to do another set column, this item, and for our temp item, we will clear the value. And then maybe we want some sort of visualization here, right? So let's add, not a condition yet. We're going to add another value. Let's do a show notification. And we could say something like item added. And let's give it a nice green check mark emoji. Like so. Okay, so that's part one of the Trebuchet adding. I'm going to hit save. All right, so if we did this correctly, now if I click any of these, it's going to run through that custom action where we're going to send the row ID of this item to the temporary column. That template column is creating that comma separated value. We're slinging that to the item lookup, right? Which is then being looked up back in our items sheet to determine whether or not we own that item. And that column is what we're using to also dictate which icon we see here. So if I click on pencils, I should see that the pencils is green. And look at that, and it's green. Very cool. All right, let's do the same thing for paper, right? Added. Folders, added. Look at that. All right, so now we have our own little custom user-specific column here. Great. But what happens if I want to remove an item, right? Clicking on it again won't do anything. All it's going to do is now it'll add, like I have two of the item, which I don't want. Right? I don't want multiple versions of these items here. I want to be able to toggle back and forth. So we need to create a remove column. So let's take a look at that. So the last thing we have to do here is create our remove functionality. It only requires two more columns in our item list and one more set of actions on our inline list. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the first thing we have to check is if the item is already owned by us. And then if so, we need to generate a new list to again overwrite our item list in our connection sheet. So ultimately what I want is a new comma separated cell to send to that Trebuchet item list sheet. So to do that, I need a list of all of the items minus the one I'm selecting. So it's going to be an if-then column here. So here I have my if remove item column. And how it works is if the item list is empty, meaning it's an item that I don't already have, then keep it empty. Next, if it is the temp item, if that temp item column is not empty, then we're going to make it empty. So basically, I'm going to select an item that we already have, for example, our pencil. It's going to fill in with the row ID, which means that this temp item will no longer be empty, but we're going to make it empty. So right now we have rows that are empty if we don't own it, and items that are empty if we are selecting them to be empty. Otherwise, we're going to do the row ID. So you see here, for example, if our remove item, these are the items that we currently own. But if I want to remove the item, let's say I type in the row ID of the pencils here. Okay, you see that now it gets cleared. And these two items are the ones remaining that I want to keep in my list. So the last thing I have to do is create a join list of this column. So I have this called remove item template. And this is a joined text or joined list column where I'm selecting the list sheet that we're currently in, and then that if then else separated by a comma. And this will be the join list that I trebuchet over to that connections item list to replace the current values with the new ones. All right, so to do that, we need a second set of actions on our inline list. So to do that, we need to figure out again which items we currently have and which ones we don't. We have the icon, so we could go by the icon, or we could go by the relation that's feeding that icon, this rel item list. So this is probably the more sound approach. So back in our item list, we're going to edit our trebuchet action to create a second set of actions that it's conditional on whether or not we already own that item. So we need to add a condition here. And again, we're going to tap into this rel item list. So that if the rel item list is empty, meaning we don't own that item, then we want to perform these actions. Otherwise, we want to remove the item. So we're going to do these same 4 actions. We're going to show notification. We could say item removed. And we can give it an emoji of this red X maybe. Fine. Then we'll do a set column. We're first going to set the temporary item to the row ID. Really, it could be set it to anything, but just to be consistent, we set it to the row ID. Okay, that will clear that value from our if removed item column. So then we're going to sling the removed item template using a set column. So our row will be the rel connection. We're going to replace the item list with this removed item template joined list column. And then lastly, we want to clear our temporary item. Done. Save. Okay, so right now, anytime I push on one of these items, it's going to check to see if we own it or not. If we do own it, it's going to add it like so. If we don't, or sorry, if we already own it, then it's going to remove it. And we should see that that green checkbox goes away. It removed pencils. Why did it remove pencils? There we go. Okay. So removed paper. Experiencing a little bit of lag. Removed folders. Should remove binders. There we go. And should remove pencils. For some reason in the builder we're experiencing a lag, but it works. Pencils, paper, folders, binders. All right, so we've developed this system. So why create this complex system? Again, going back to the beginning of the video, we mentioned that we could do a very simple version of this just using a user-specific column if this list is singularly user-specific. But because we are tapping into this connection sheet, and our list is looking at that lead email, whoever it might be, regardless of which person we're signed in with, we know that this list of owned and unowned items will be shared across all users. So if I switch to a different user here, like Bob, we see that they have the same 3 check marks. And if Bob decides, you know what, we don't have paper anymore, he can click on paper, the item is removed, not only for Bob, but also for Jimmy, and also for the lead user, right? And if Jimmy decides, you know what, I bought some more paper and we have some crayons now, right? Bob can now see that, yes, we have crayons and we have more paper. So now we have a shared list of items. And if we view this as any other user that's not part of the connection, so I'm going to create here in the user sheet just another random user like test3@email.com. Okay, you see that they're not part of this lead email because they were not one of the invited users, which means that in the list, if I view as that person, right, they have their own set of data here. Now, the only hiccup to this is that this user is not in the connection sheet because this user didn't invite anybody yet, which means this whole functionality won't work. So we need to find a way to add them to the connection sheet if they haven't yet invited somebody. And so maybe we have some user onboarding that we need to take care of first, right? So on their user sheet, before they're allowed to invite a user or even view the list, maybe they have to set up their profile. So we have a button here that says like, create profile, which not only adds information to their sheet, but also adds a row to the connection sheet where the email and their name is the person's email and name, and their lead email will just be themselves, right? So we could have something like user email address, something like this. So they create a profile, right? And now they exist in the sheet, which means they can now have some connections because that lead email will make that connection. So hopefully, if we click on pencils, now we see item added, right? And then paper, item added, and pencils and paper, something like that. All right, so this situation of using the Trebuchet method was pretty advanced, but well worth it as we can now have a shared list of items between multiple users. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me by leaving a comment below or find me at Twitter at rpetito. And as always, thanks for watching.